Mrs. Harris closed the bathroom door and walked toward the student. Megan looked anxiously at her teacher. She expected that Mrs. Harris would scold her for not doing her homework. It wasn't the first time since she hadn't done her homework, and Mrs. Harris wasn't the only one who wasn't happy about it. All the teachers complained about it. The teacher was silent for a while, hesitant to say anything. "I'll do better, Mrs. Harris, I promise. I just haven't had time. My athletic training takes too much of my time." The girl decided to break the silence. Mrs. Harris was shocked and wanted to object. Megan was unaware that Mrs. Harris had already talked to her coach, and he said the girl had given up training a long time ago. However, now she had asked her student to stay after school for a different reason. Mrs. Harris was embarrassed to ask her about it, but she dared anyway. "You know, I have a daughter," the teacher suddenly started talking about her private life. "She's your age, but she has some problems." Next, the woman took a deep breath and talked quickly as if she were afraid of being interrupted. She puzzled the schoolgirl with her confession. Very few people knew that Mrs. Harris's 13-year-old daughter was disabled since birth. She is homeschooled and she has no friends at all. No real friends to invite home, to go for a walk together, to spend some time together in the real world. Virtual friends are something different. Her daughter, Lizzie, really lacked communication in real life. And now, the teacher wanted to ask her student to be her daughter's friend for just one evening. She is willing to pay for this service. Also, she could get some of Megan's grades up and help with her studies. Mrs. Harris couldn't just tamper with all her grades. The other teachers and the principal would notice it, and they'd both get in trouble. But she was willing to help in any way she could. The student looked at her teacher in confusion. She didn't even know how to react. If someone else had asked her to do it, she would have said no, laughed, and told everyone about it. But it was her teacher. Mrs. Harris was an excellent teacher. The children loved and respected her. Besides, Megan didn't mind getting her grades up. She was having trouble with her studies, and her parents sometimes even scolded her. "I guess I could do it," the girl agreed uncertainly. "But my daughter Lizzie has a very bad temper," Mrs. Harris warned her. The teacher blushed. It was a sensitive issue for her. She never talked about her personal life, kept everything a secret, and asked her student to keep it between them. The problem was that her daughter was wheelchair-bound, and it was for life. But even that was not the main problem for her daughter. She didn't look attractive. Frankly, the girl was ugly. It made Lizzie suffer. When Lizzie was a child, she was constantly bullied. Mrs. Harris took her to a specialized center for children with disabilities, but even there, all the children made fun of her. As a result, the girl closed herself off and wouldn't let anyone into her life. All she could do was express aggression as a preventative reaction. Mrs. Harris enrolled Lizzie in a distance education program to protect her from cruelty. And now, seeing her daughter suffer, she made the desperate decision to find her a friend for money so that she could spend at least one evening with her daughter as a real friend. Megan listened to her and said it wasn't a problem. She would spend some time with Lizzie. They agreed that Megan would come over today, ostensibly to do math with Mrs. Harris. Then Mrs. Harris will get a call from a friend asking her to come over and help. The woman will leave the girls home alone. She'll say she'll be back soon, but she'll spend a couple of hours at her friend's place. If there's any trouble, Megan will call and she'll come back right away. In the evening, Megan came to Mrs. Harris, and first, the teacher offered tea. The three of them sat at the table. Lizzie did not say a word, only glanced angrily at their visitor. Then the telephone rang, and her mother said she had to leave urgently, but she would be back soon. As they had agreed, Mrs. Harris asked Megan to wait there, and Megan said she was in no hurry. In fact, Mrs. Harris went to her neighbor. She was afraid there would be some trouble, so she decided not to go too far away so she could get home quickly. Their neighbor was an elderly woman, and she was happy to have company to talk. But Mrs. Harris stayed there longer than she had planned, and when she looked at her watch, she was horrified and immediately rushed home. When she entered the apartment, she was dizzy from shock. She couldn't stay on her feet and fell into a chair. The girls looked at Mrs. Harris frightened, but before that, they were talking and laughing. It had been a long time since the woman had heard her daughter laugh. But what surprised her even more was Lizzie's appearance. The mother, used to seeing her daughter permanently gloomy, was now looking at a completely different person. It was her daughter, but she was somehow different. She had a new hairstyle, curls covering her cheeks, hiding part of her face, and making it visually more attractive. There was also makeup on her face. The girl was glowing with happiness. The woman couldn't believe it was possible and tried to hide the tears of joy. "Oh, sorry I'm late." Mrs. Harris came to her senses and pulled a box of chocolates out of her bag. "My friend gave me a box of chocolates so I wouldn't come back home with empty hands. Would you like some tea?" The girls nodded happily. The woman hurried into the kitchen but tried to listen to what the children were talking about. She could hear Lizzie telling Megan about her favorite game and promising her new friend to help with computer science. But suddenly, Mrs. Harris's heart ached. She imagined her daughter's disappointment when she would realize that Megan was not her true friend. The woman wiped away her tears. She hardly dared ask her student for such a favor again. Also, she didn't have much money to pay for such a friendship. But she chased those thoughts away. She should be happy with what she has now. And now her daughter Lizzie was happy. Let this evening end well, and then she would figure out what to do next. As they sat at the table drinking tea, the teacher secretly glanced at her student. Mrs. Harris was afraid that Megan would not find common ground with Lizzie, and, on the contrary, might offend her. But now she realized that she was not mistaken in her choice. But she was ashamed that she had actually forced the girl to do it in order to be able to improve her bad grades. This idea had occurred to Mrs. Harris long ago, but there was little choice among the students. She thought about a student she could ask for such an unusual favor. There was one quiet, modest, straight-A student at school who would gladly agree, perhaps even without money. But Lizzie would hardly be willing to talk to her. She would rather offend her. The other students were gossipy, and Mrs. Harris was worried that they would tell everyone about it. The principal would find out, and she would be in big trouble. And Megan was a troublemaker, a bad-tempered but cheerful girl, and that's why the teacher chose her. Megan could fight back against Lizzie if she behaved aggressively, and at the same time, she wouldn't dare to hurt her daughter. Otherwise, she could say goodbye to good grades. Mrs. Harris would never lower Megan's grades, which were already bad, but by blackmailing her with grades, she could force Megan to keep quiet. But also, she paid her money for the favor. For her daughter's sake, the mother was willing to do anything. It was painful for her to watch Lizzie look enviously at the happy little girls in the movies. She understood that her daughter also dreamed of real friends, but this world was cruel, and she could not adapt to it. Since childhood, Lizzie suffered because of her unattractive appearance. When she was a child, her mother took her to different events for children with disabilities, but even there, she couldn't find friends. And now she just closed herself off from everyone, and the slightest attempts to communicate with her only caused aggression. Lizzie was smart, and learning was easy for her, but she spent all her free time in the virtual world, where no one saw her wheelchair or her face. But still, she lacked real communication. Her mother thought that if she found her a friend, her daughter's behavior would change. The woman didn't expect it to work out so well. Although, as Lizzie later confessed, she had immediately ignored their visitor when Megan tried to talk to her, answering sharply and asking her to stay away from her. She had no intention of communicating with her at all, but Megan surprised her when she told her she was jealous of her. At first, Lizzie thought the girl was making fun of her. How could anyone envy a disabled person who was so ugly? But Megan replied that it wasn't about appearance. Nowadays, plastic surgery can change anyone's appearance. But Lizzie has a wonderful mother who loves her and supports her in everything. Also, Lizzie is smart and doing well in school. Megan told Lizzie that it is possible to change appearance, but it's hardly possible to make a person smarter. And not everyone's parents are that great. Although Lizzie didn't have a father, she had a loving mom. Megan had problems in her family, and she didn't want to talk about them. Megan assured Lizzie that even people with disabilities have a chance to find a good job, have a family, and be happy. Megan could do nothing about Lizzie's disability, but she could help to change her appearance. She has a sister who works in a beauty salon. She taught her a lot. The girl planned to follow in her sister's footsteps later. Megan said she could do Lizzie's makeup and hair. She ended up with an almost magical makeover. Both girls were happy with the result, and Mrs. Harris was glad that her daughter now had hope. Perhaps now she would believe in herself. Mrs. Harris was very grateful to Megan for all she had done. And she was surprised when the next day the doorbell rang and Megan was standing on the threshold again. The woman was confused. "Megan, I'm sorry, but I don't have any money to pay you today," the teacher apologized quietly. "No, Mrs. Harris, you don't have to pay. I'm here to see my friend," Megan replied. "Mom, who's there? Megan?" Her daughter's voice came from the room. Megan walked briskly into the apartment and hurried into Lizzie's room, and Mrs. Harris stood there with her mouth open, unable to believe. It turned out that the girls had arranged to meet yesterday. Since Mrs. Harris and Megan had initially agreed that she would come to do math, she had told Lizzie the same thing. And while Megan was doing Lizzie's makeup, she was explaining math to her. And then it turned out that Megan was having problems with all the subjects, and Lizzie offered her help. They decided to start with computer science. Lizzie was great at teaching and explaining. Also, she and Megan were the same age, so they quickly hit it off. Megan often visited Lizzie, and Mrs. Harris was happy. Naturally, they began to talk a lot, and the teacher learned that the girl's family was dysfunctional. Megan's parents were alcoholics. She was lucky that her older sister had already left her parents' home, started working, and could now help her younger sister. The girl dressed well only because of her sister, who sometimes gave her some of her old clothes, and rarely could afford to buy something new for Megan. Her parents didn't care about their daughter. That's why Megan had such a bad temper. She was angry at the world. The girl lacked parental attention, so at school, she tried to draw attention to herself and misbehaved. She was cheeky and brave among her peers. Everyone respected her and her company, and she felt needed among her friends. But there was no one to help her with her studies. But she didn't really want to do well in school, and she didn't dare even to think about applying to university. She was sure that all she could achieve was to get a job in a beauty salon, just like her sister. However, after she met Lizzie, she developed other interests. Now she believed that she could enter the university and get a decent education. Megan couldn't even dream of computer science because she didn't even have a computer at home, and she used to tell her friends that she wasn't interested in it. Her phone was enough for her. But when she started studying computer science with Lizzie, she found it fascinating. Megan often visited Mrs. Harris and Lizzie, and sometimes even stayed overnight just because she didn't want to see her drunken parents arguing. Her parents didn't mind. They didn't really care. And sometimes they even forgot she existed. But she was happy, and so was Lizzie. The girls decided to apply to the same university after school to study computer science. They knew they could support each other in a difficult situation. That's how one timid teacher's request turned out to be the beginning of a true friendship between different, but somehow similar girls. They were both angry at the world, each for a different reason, but they helped each other to change.